On the morning of January 9th, 1996, the temperature in Lyon County, Minnesota, was minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It had been below minus 20 for 6 consecutive days and was forecast to stay there for 5 more. At some point during the night of January 8th, nobody knew exactly when because the failure was gradual and the first sign was a trickle becoming nothing. The rural water main that ran along the county road froze solid at 4 separate points along its 4-mile stretch. 12 farms on that road depended on the rural water line as their primary or sole water source. By 8 in the morning on January 9th, 11 of them had no water. Mick Haugen's farm was the 12th. Mick had water. He had water because his grandfather Olaf had dug a well by hand in the summer of 1931, 31 feet into a shallow aquifer, and because Mick's father Walt had maintained that well through the 1960s and 1970s, when the rural water line arrived and every neighbor capped their old wells, and because Mick had maintained it in turn through the 1980s and 1990s, despite the rural water district's periodic suggestions that he cap the old well, simplify his system, and save himself the annual inspection fee. The well was running at minus 32. It had been running every day since 1931. It would run every day for as long as the farm existed and someone maintained it, because at 31 feet of depth, the water table sat 12 feet below the Minnesota frost line. Even in the worst winters the state had produced in the previous 100 years. And water 12 feet below the frost line does not freeze regardless of what the air temperature above it is doing. The rural water main was buried at 6 feet. In a normal Minnesota winter, the frost line reaches 4 to 5 feet. In January 1996, it reached 7, and at 7 feet, the PVC pipe that had served 12 farms without incident for 22 years was a solid tube of ice. Let me tell you about Olaf Haugen, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he built and why it is still running. Olaf had come to Lyon County from Norway in 1912, a young man of 25 who had been farming since he was 12 and who had carried across the Atlantic one conviction that shaped everything he built on the Minnesota farm: that water is not a convenience. Water is the first question a farm must answer before it can answer any other question, and the answer must be certain. But he had bought the 360-acre Lyon County place in 1924 with savings from 12 years of farm labor and a loan from a Norwegian Lutheran Church Lending Society in Marshall. The farm had a cistern, a brick-lined underground collection tank for rainwater from the roof, but no well. The previous owner had used the cistern for household water and hauled water for livestock from a neighbor's pond when the cistern ran low. This was, to Olaf's Norwegian sensibility, not a satisfactory answer to the first question a farm must answer. He had tried drilling in 1928. The driller had found water at 26 feet, but the yield was marginal. The aquifer at that location produced perhaps 2 gallons per minute, enough for the house, but not for the 60 head of cattle Olaf was running. The driller had proposed going deeper to 60 feet, hours where he believed the yield would improve. The deeper drilling cost $380. Olaf did not have $380 in 1928. He had managed with the shallow drill in the cistern through 1928, 1929, and 1930, always short on water in dry spells, always nervous about the cistern level in late summer, always aware that his water answer was not a certain answer. In 1931, he resolved to fix this. Not with a driller. He still did not have $380, but with his own hands and his own back. He had read about hand-dug wells in a Norwegian farm almanac he had brought from home. He had talked to an older Norwegian farmer in the county who had dug 2 hand-dug wells on his homestead in the 1890s. He had walked the farm and identified the low ground at the northwest corner of the barnyard where the soil stayed moist longest after rain, to indicating a shallow water-bearing layer not far below the surface. On June 14, 1931, Olaf Haugen began digging. He dug alone. His son Walt was 11 and could haul buckets of soil from the shaft using the rope and pulley system Olaf had built from scrap lumber. But the digging itself was Olaf's work. He had a long-handled pick and a short-handled shovel and a carpenter's plumb bob to keep the shaft vertical. He dug 3 feet the first day, 2.5 on the second. Progress slowed below 15 feet as the soil changed from sandy loam to clay, and the work of loosening and lifting got harder with the confined space. He encountered water at 28 feet, not a gush, a seep. The sides of the shaft began to glisten, and the bottom began to soften, and by the time he had dug to 30 feet, there was an inch of standing water at the bottom. He dug 1 more foot to 31. The water was ankle deep. He lined the shaft with flat fieldstone, stone he had been collecting from the farm's rocky pasture ground all spring, carrying it to the well site in a wheelbarrow, fitting each piece by hand. The dry stacking method, no mortar, each stone fitted against its neighbor, so the wall was stable, but the water could seep through the gaps between them. He worked from the bottom up as he removed soil from the shaft, fitting the stone lining before the earth walls could slump. It took 4 more days after the digging was complete. The total time from first shovel to complete lined well, 17 days. He installed a hand pump, a cast-iron lift pump mounted on a wooden platform over the well opening, and ran a pipe to the stock tank in the barn. The water yield at full pump capacity was approximately 8 gallons per minute, more than enough for the house, the cattle, the chickens, and every other water need on the farm. He said to Walt when the pump was running, "Now the farm has water." Walt had looked at the pump handle. He said, "What if it stops?" Olaf had said, "Then you fix what stopped it." He looked at Walt. "But the water will not stop. The water is at 31 feet. Nothing stops the water at 31 feet. He paused. "What stops is the equipment above it. Keep the equipment working, and the water is always there." Walt kept the equipment working for 41 years. He replaced the hand pump with an electric submersible in 1954. He replaced the pump motor in 1961 and again in 1973. He replaced the drop pipe in 1968. He checked the wellhead every morning the way Olaf had checked it, because checking it every morning was how you found the small problem before it became the large one. When the rural water line came to Lyon County in the early 1970s, and the Rural Water District offered connections at a favorable rate, Walt had connected. He had connected for the convenience and the reliability of a second water source, not as a replacement for the well. He had never stopped using the well as the primary water source for the barn. He had never capped it. He had never considered capping it. He told Mick when Mick took over the farm in 1970, "The rural line is good for the house and the yard hydrants. Keep the well for the barn." He paused. "The line will freeze someday." He looked at Mick. "The well at 31 feet will not." Mick had said, "You think the line will freeze." Walt had said, "I think winter is longer than any pipe system plans for." He paused. "Your grandfather was not wrong about the first question. Water is the first thing. Let me tell you about the Rural Water District's suggestion, because it is where the antagonist enters and where the story's two paths become visible. In 1984, a Lyon County Rural Water District inspector named Dennis had come to the Haugen farm as part of a county-wide well assessment under new state groundwater protection regulations. He had looked at the hand-dug well, the red-lidded wooden curb, the concrete apron Mick had poured in 1982 on the electric pump on its mounting bracket, and had made his recommendation. "Mr. Haugen," Dennis had said, "this well is a potential contamination pathway under the new state rules. A hand-dug well of this construction, stone-lined without a grouted casing, is considered a Class 4 well under the new classification system." The recommendation is capping. Mick had said, "It's been producing clean water since 1931. Dennis had said, "I understand that, but the regulatory classification is based on construction type, not performance history." He paused. "Capping it would also save you the annual inspection fee." He looked at the well. "It's $180 a year." Gary Pladsen, who had stopped by that morning for a different reason and was standing at the edge of the barnyard listening, had looked at Mick and said, "He's right, Mick. I capped ours last fall. The rural line is perfectly reliable." He paused. $180 a year is $180. Mick had looked at Dennis. He had looked at Gary. He had looked at the well. He had said, "My grandfather dug it by hand in 1931. My father kept it running for 40 years. He paused. "I'm going to keep it running." Dennis had noted the refusal in his inspection report and driven to the next farm. Gary had shrugged and gone home. Mick paid the annual inspection fee every year from 1984 through 1995. 12 years at $180. $2,160 total. Let me tell you about what Gary's farm looked like on the morning of January 9th, 1996, and the morning of January 10th, and every morning for 11 days. Because that is the other path running to its conclusion. Gary Pladsen had 140 head of cattle in his barn, but they needed approximately 4,000 gallons of water per day in January. At minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit, a cow that does not drink will not eat, and a cow that does not eat in that temperature begins burning her body condition at a rate that does not recover quickly. By the third day without water, January 11th, Gary's cattle were showing stress. Not in any single dramatic way, but in the accumulated small ways that cattle show stress when the basic need is not met. Reduced feed consumption, restlessness, early signs of dehydration visible in the texture of their coats and the dryness of their muzzles. Gary had tried hauling water from the town of Marshall on January 9th. The tank trailer held 1,500 gallons. The round trip was 40 minutes. He could make 6 runs in a day, 9,000 gallons. If the roads were clear and the loading dock at the Marshall Water Treatment Plant stayed open. The roads were not always clear. The loading dock was not always open. On January 10th, he made 4 runs. On January 11th, 3. The cattle were not getting enough. He drove to Mick's farm on the morning of January 11th. He pulled into the yard with the stock tank trailer. Mick was in the barn doing morning chores. "Gary," Mick said. Gary said, "I need to fill the trailer." Mick said, "The yard hydrant is running." He paused. "How many head have you got without water?" Gary said, 140, going on 3 days. Mick said, "Pull the trailer to the hydrant." They did not discuss the well or the annual fee or the 1984 conversation. Mick turned the yard hydrant on and Gary filled his trailer. Mick's barn was warm and his 180 head of Angus cattle were drinking from the stock tank connected to the hand-dug well that had been providing water to this barn since 1931. Gary made 3 trips to Mick's farm that day and 4 the following day. By January 14th, 4 other farms on the road had found out the Haugen well was running and were asking to use the yard hydrant. Mick said yes to all of them. He managed the drawdown on the well by spacing the fills, no more than 2 trailers per hour, giving the aquifer time to replenish at its 8-gallon-per-minute yield rate. He watched the wellhead for any drop in pressure that would indicate the aquifer was being drawn faster than it was recharging. The aquifer held. The well held. The pump held. 11 days. To 8 farms sharing the water, and Olaf's 31-foot stone-lined well produced every gallon without complaint. Let me stop here and explain why the hand-dug well ran when the rural water main did not. Because the physics of it is the hidden advantage, and it is worth understanding precisely. Water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature on January 9th through January 19th in Lyon County was between minus 28 and minus 32 degrees at the surface. The frost penetrated the soil to a depth determined by the soil type, the insulating cover of snow, and the duration of the cold event. The rural water main was buried at 6 feet. In a normal Minnesota winter, minus 15 for a week, minus 20 for a day or two, cold but not sustained cold. 6 feet is deep enough. The frost reaches 4 feet, sometimes 4.5, and the pipe at 6 feet stays above freezing through the soil's thermal mass. This is why the rural line had worked for 22 years. In January 1996, the sustained minus 30 temperatures, combined with the lack of snow cover along the road right-of-way where the wind had scoured it clean, pushed the frost line to 7 feet. At 7 feet, the pipe at 6 feet was inside the frozen zone. It froze. The Haugen hand-dug well went to 31 feet. The frost at minus 32, sustained for 11 days, reached 7 feet in open ground. The temperature at 31 feet in Lyon County in any winter is approximately 48 degrees Fahrenheit, the mean annual temperature of the ground at depth, which does not vary with surface conditions because the thermal mass of 31 feet of Minnesota soil insulates it completely from what is happening at the surface. At 31 feet, in January 1996, it was 48 degrees, and the water was liquid and had been liquid without interruption since 1931. The hand-dug well did not run because Mick was lucky or because the weather cooperated. It ran because 31 feet of soil is a better insulator than 6 feet of soil, and water at 48 degrees does not freeze at minus 32, any more than it freezes at 72. Olaf had chosen 31 feet, not because he was doing thermal calculations. He had chosen 31 feet because that was where the water was in adequate yield. But 31 feet happened to be 31 feet, which happened to be 25 feet below the deepest frost penetration Lyon County had produced in the previous 100 years of recorded weather history. The choice was driven by water yield. The result was thermal protection deeper than anything the rural water engineering of the early 1970s had provided. Let me tell you about the conversations at the end of the 11 days, because there were 2 of them, and they were different. On January 19th, the rural water line was repaired. The Lyon County Rural Water District had sent crews with propane thaw equipment to the 4 frozen sections and had them running by noon. Gary drove his trailer to Mick's farm one last time that afternoon to return the water he had borrowed, meaning he made several extra runs to the Haugen Yard hydrant and filled a tank at Gary's barn to replenish what Mick's well had provided over 11 days. This was not required. Mick had not asked for it. Gary did it because he was that kind of man. He found Mick at the well checking the pump after the long stretch of heavy use. "Mick," Gary said. "Gary, how much did you pull out of there in 11 days?" Mick had calculated it. He said, 8 farms, varying amounts. "I estimate about 110,000 gallons total." He looked at the wellhead. The aquifer didn't drop more than about 3 feet at the peak draw and recovered between fills. He paused. It handled it. Gary looked at the well, at the red-lidded wooden curb on the concrete apron, at the old electric pump on its mounting bracket, at the 1931 construction that had just provided 110,000 gallons of water to 8 Lyon County farms through the worst cold event in a generation. He said, "What did the annual fee run?" Mick said, $180. Gary said, "You paid that for how many years?" Mick said, "Since '84 when Dennis came to inspect." He paused. 12 years? Gary said, 12 times 180 is 2160. Mick said, "Yes?" Gary looked at the well. He said, "My father capped ours in '84, the same year I told you to cap yours." He paused. "What would it cost to put ours back?" Mick said, "Depends on whether the stone lining is intact. Could be $400 for a new pump and some drop pipe if the lining is good. Could be more if you need to reline." Gary said, "How do I find out if the lining is intact?" Mick said, "Drop a light down and look." He looked at Gary. "If the stone is still there and solid, you're in good shape. These stone-lined wells last a long time if they're not disturbed." He paused. "Your grandfather built a good one." Gary drove home. He pulled the cap on his family's old hand-dug well that weekend. He dropped a work light down on a rope. The stone lining was intact. The well had been capped for 12 years, and the water at the bottom was clear. He had a pump installed the following week. He started paying the annual inspection fee in 1997. The second conversation was quieter and happened the same afternoon. Mick went back to the barn after Gary left. He stood at the stock tank and watched his cattle drink. The water in the tank was the temperature it always was, slightly warmer than the barn air, because it had come up from 48 degrees at 31 feet, and had not had time to cool to barn temperature before the cattle drank it. His grandfather Olaf had said it in 1931, "The water will not stop. What stops is the equipment above it. Keep the equipment working, and the water is always there." Mick had kept the equipment working. The water had always been there. He went to the farmhouse and found the payment stub for the 1995 annual inspection fee, $180, paid in April of 1995. He put it in the same drawer where he kept the farm records. Then he wrote out the check for the 1996 fee. He did not wait for the invoice. Let me tell you the last thing, because it is the thing Walt would have wanted you to know. Walt Haugen had died in 1988, 8 years before the 1996 freeze event that proved what he had told Mick in 1970. He had maintained the well for 41 years, through the arrival of the rural water line, through every neighbor's suggestion that he cap it, through every winter Lyon County had sent him. He had handed it to Mick not as a piece of equipment, but as a principle. The first question: water is the first thing. Answer it with certainty. He had checked the well every morning for 41 years. Mick had checked it every morning for 26 more. The morning checks were not ceremonial. They were the maintenance practice that kept the equipment working so the water would always be there. Our 308,000 mornings, Walt's and Mick's combined, of checking the well. Not one morning where the check found it had stopped. Mick's son farms the place now. He checks the well every morning. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the wells dug by hand in the summer of 1931 by men who understood that the first question a farm must answer is water, and that the answer must be certain, of the annual fees paid for 12 years without explanation and with complete understanding of the reason, of the neighbors who drove into the yard in January with a stock tank trailer and got what they needed without the conversation about why Mick had kept the old well. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, does your farm still have its original well? Is it running? Olaf dug 31 feet by hand in 17 days in the summer of 1931. At 31 feet, the water is 48 degrees. At minus 32 at the surface, it is still 48 degrees at 31 feet. It was 48 degrees on January 9th, 1996. It was 48 degrees on January 19th when the rural line came back. It was 48 degrees every morning in between. The water will not stop. What stops is the equipment above it. Keep the equipment working, and the water is always there. Olaf said it in 1931. Walt said it again in 1970. The well has been proving it every morning since.